Magnus Blackthorn and the Mystery of the Venetian Mirror. The rain drummed against the tall windows of our Milan apartment as I sat reviewing case files, the familiar scratch of my pen against paper the only sound breaking the evening silence. I am Dr. Elena Torretti, and what I am about to recount represents not only my first encounter with the most extraordinary mind I have ever encountered, but also the beginning of a partnership that would forever change both our lives. It was late October when the letter arrived, bearing an elegant seal and written in precise handwriting on expensive cream paper. The sender introduced himself as Magnus Blackthorn, a consulting detective who had read my published research on criminal psychology and forensic profiling. He requested a meeting, suggesting that my expertise might prove valuable in solving cases that had baffled conventional investigators. Intrigued by his confidence and the subtle intelligence evident in his correspondence, I agreed to meet him at Café Central the following afternoon. I arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, scanning the crowded cafe for someone matching the vague description he had provided. A tall, impeccably dressed man in his mid-30s approached my table before I could locate him. His dark hair was perfectly groomed, and his gray eyes seemed to assess everything around him with unsettling intensity. He wore a charcoal wool coat and carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Dr. Torretti," he said, extending a gloved hand. "Magnus Blackthorn, you arrived exactly on time, having taken the metro from your office near the university, stopping briefly at the pharmacy to collect a prescription for your elderly neighbor, Mrs. Benedetti, who suffers from arthritis. You chose this particular seat because it offers clear views of both entrances while positioning your back to the wall, a habit developed during your military service." I stared at him, speechless. Every detail was correct, though I could not fathom how he had deduced such specific information about my afternoon activities and personal habits. "Your expression suggests I have your attention," he continued, settling into the chair across from me with fluid grace. "The mud pattern on your shoes indicates the metro entrance nearest the university. The slight medicinal odor clinging to your jacket suggests recent proximity to pharmaceuticals, while the prescription envelope protruding slightly from your purse bears Mrs. Benedetti's name, visible through the translucent paper. Your seating choice and posture reflect tactical awareness consistent with military training, which your bearing and the small scar on your left hand from field medical work confirm." "Remarkable," I managed, though a part of me wondered if this was some elaborate ruse. "But you mentioned cases. What sort of cases?" Magnus smiled, though the expression did not reach his eyes. "The sort that confound ordinary minds, Dr. Torretti. Cases where conventional investigation fails because investigators see only what they expect to see, rather than what is actually before them. I believe your psychological training and medical background would complement my methods perfectly." Before I could respond, his attention shifted abruptly to something beyond my shoulder. His eyes narrowed, focusing with laser-like intensity on a commotion near the cafe entrance. A well-dressed elderly gentleman was speaking urgently with the manager, gesturing dramatically and appearing quite distressed. "Our conversation may be interrupted shortly," Magnus murmured, rising smoothly from his seat. "That gentleman is about to request police assistance regarding what he believes to be a theft, though the truth is considerably more complex." The elderly man spotted Magnus and hurried toward our table, his face flushed with anxiety. "Excuse me," he said in accented English, "but I overheard you mention investigations. I am Professor Alessandro Contini, and I desperately need help. Something impossible has occurred, and the police will never believe me." Magnus gestured for the professor to join us. "Please sit. Tell us what has happened." Professor Contini collapsed into a chair, running trembling hands through his silver hair. 3 days ago, I acquired a magnificent Venetian mirror from an estate sale. 17th century, absolutely priceless. I had it authenticated by 2 independent experts who confirmed its provenance and value. This morning, I discovered it had been replaced by a nearly identical fake, but I know this is impossible. "Why impossible?" I asked, my psychological training prompting me to probe for details that might reveal delusion or false memory. "Because the mirror never left my villa," the professor replied, his voice cracking with emotion. "It hangs in my private study, which has only one entrance. The windows are barred and alarmed, installed after a break-in 3 years ago. The room is monitored by security cameras that show no unauthorized entry. Yet somehow, someone replaced a priceless antique with a worthless reproduction without leaving any trace of their presence. Magnus leaned forward, his gray eyes brightening with interest. Describe the differences between the original and the current mirror. The frame carving is cruder, the silver backing less reflective, and the glass itself lacks the subtle imperfections characteristic of 17th century Venetian craftsmanship. Any expert would immediately recognize it as a modern reproduction, probably worth less than €1,000 compared to the original's value of nearly $500,000. Who knew about your acquisition? Magnus inquired. Only a few people. My assistant, Paolo, who helps manage my collection. The auction house dealer, Signora Rossi, who arranged the purchase. My daughter, Francesca, who lives in Rome but visited last weekend. And my neighbor, Dr. Martinelli, who occasionally advises me on insurance matters. Magnus stood abruptly. Dr. Torretti, would you care to examine this puzzle firsthand? Professor, we shall accompany you to your villa immediately. The drive to Professor Contini's villa in the hills outside Milan took nearly an hour, during which Magnus questioned our host about every aspect of the mirror's acquisition and storage. The professor's answers remained consistent, and his distress appeared genuine. The villa was a beautiful 19th century structure surrounded by manicured gardens. Professor Contini led us through elegantly appointed rooms filled with antiques and artwork to his private study, a wood-paneled chamber dominated by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The disputed mirror hung on the wall opposite the single entrance, reflecting the room's scholarly atmosphere. Magnus approached the mirror with careful steps, producing a magnifying glass from his coat pocket. He examined the frame minutely, running his fingers along the carved details while Professor Contini hovered anxiously nearby. After several minutes of silent inspection, Magnus turned to the security camera mounted in the corner. The system records continuously? He asked. Yes, with motion detection. The footage is stored on a server in the basement. We shall need to review 3 days of recordings, Magnus said. But first, Dr. Torretti, what do you observe about the mirror's current position? I studied the mirror carefully, applying the observational techniques Magnus had demonstrated earlier. The frame appeared slightly askew, though this could be normal. The reflection seemed clear, if less lustrous than one might expect from a genuine antique. The positioning appears slightly off-center, I ventured. Precisely. The original hung 2 centimeters higher and 3 centimeters further left, based on the faint marks on the wallpaper visible under magnification. This suggests the mirror was removed and rehung, though perhaps not by someone familiar with its original position. We spent the next 2 hours reviewing security footage in the villa's basement office. The recordings showed no unauthorized entry into the study, though Professor Contini had entered several times over the 3-day period, as had his assistant Paolo during his daily visits. Magnus watched each sequence with intense concentration, occasionally asking to replay certain segments. Professor, Magnus said finally, when did you last examine the mirror closely before discovering the substitution? Thursday evening, when I showed it to Dr. Martinelli. He was quite impressed by its beauty and craftsmanship. And you discovered the replacement this morning, Sunday. What prompted you to examine it so carefully? Professor Contini hesitated. The light seemed different. When I entered the study this morning, the reflection appeared somehow wrong, less brilliant than I remembered. Upon closer inspection, I realized it was not the same mirror. Magnus nodded thoughtfully. We shall need to interview each person who knew about the mirror. Dr. Torretti, would you accompany me? Your psychological expertise may prove invaluable in detecting deception. Over the following day, we spoke with each suspect. Paolo, the assistant, was a nervous young man who clearly idolized the professor, but seemed genuinely shocked by the news of the theft. Signora Rossi, the dealer, was professional and cooperative, providing detailed documentation of the mirror's provenance. Dr. Martinelli, the neighbor, was a cultured gentleman who expressed appropriate concern, but seemed oddly detached from the situation. Francesca Contini proved the most interesting interview. She met us at an expensive restaurant in Milan's Brera district, arriving in a new BMW that seemed incongruous with her claimed financial difficulties. She was a striking woman in her early 40s, impeccably groomed and wearing jewelry that appeared quite valuable. Daddy has always been obsessed with his collections, she said, stirring her espresso with apparent indifference. He spends fortunes on old things while complaining about money. This mirror business is probably just another of his imaginary crises. You sound skeptical about the theft, I observed. Daddy's getting old. His memory isn't what it was. He probably sold the mirror himself and forgot, or perhaps he never bought the genuine article in the first place. These dealers are notorious for their clever deceptions. Magnus had remained silent throughout most of the interview, but now he leaned forward slightly. Your father mentioned you visited last weekend. Did you see the mirror then? Briefly. He insisted on showing off his latest acquisition as usual. It looked like any other old mirror to me. Yet you seem quite knowledgeable about antique dealing practices, Magnus observed. Francesca's composure flickered momentarily. One picks up things when constantly hearing about authenticity issues and market values. As we left the restaurant, Magnus appeared deeply thoughtful. Dr. Torretti, what is your psychological assessment of our interviews? Paolo seemed genuinely distressed and protective of the professor. Signora Rossi was professional but appeared to be holding something back, though this might simply be discretion regarding client confidentiality. Dr. Martinelli struck me as oddly detached, almost amused by the situation. Francesca displayed classic signs of deception, particularly when discussing her knowledge of antiques and her financial situation. Excellent observations, Magnus replied. However, the solution to this puzzle lies not in psychology but in physics and timing. We must return to the villa immediately. Back at Professor Contini's study, Magnus positioned himself before the mirror and began a curious ritual. He stood motionless for several minutes, apparently lost in thought, then began moving around the room in a precise pattern, pausing at specific locations to make notes in a small leather journal. Professor, he said finally, I need you to recreate exactly what happened when you discovered the substitution this morning. Professor Contini repeated his morning routine, entering the study and approaching his desk. I was gathering papers for today's lecture when I glanced up and noticed the reflection seemed wrong. The light quality was different, less vibrant than I remembered. Magnus nodded slowly. And Thursday evening, when you showed the mirror to Dr. Martinelli, where exactly did you both stand? Here, near the desk, and then we moved closer to examine the carving detail. At what time did this examination occur? Around 8 o'clock, just after dinner. Magnus smiled suddenly, the expression transforming his usually stern features. Dr. Torretti, the solution is now clear. Would you care to theorize based on our observations? I considered everything we had learned, trying to apply Magnus's methods of deduction. The timing seems significant, and you mentioned physics. The mirror's position was altered, suggesting it was removed and replaced. But the security footage shows no unauthorized entry. Continue, Magnus encouraged. Someone with legitimate access must have made the switch, but it would need to be someone who could return repeatedly without suspicion. Paolo visits daily, Francesca was here recently, and Dr. Martinelli examined the mirror Thursday evening. You are approaching the truth, but missing the crucial element that makes this crime possible, Magnus said. Consider the timing of Professor Contini's discovery relative to the season and the room's orientation. Suddenly, I understood. The light. You asked about the time of Dr. Martinelli's visit, and the professor noticed the difference in reflection quality this morning. The study faces east, so morning light would reveal details invisible in evening illumination. Precisely, Magnus exclaimed, but you have not yet identified the method or the perpetrator. He turned to Professor Contini, who had been listening with growing confusion. Professor, your mirror was never stolen. It was never replaced. What you purchased last week was already a reproduction, but an extraordinarily sophisticated one designed to fool even expert examination under specific lighting conditions. Professor Contini's face went pale. But the authentication. Consider who arranged the authentication, who had access to the mirror both before and after your purchase, and who possessed the expertise to create such a convincing deception. Magnus continued relentlessly. Signora Rossi specializes in Venetian antiques and has access to skilled craftsmen capable of creating museum-quality reproductions. She arranged for authentication by experts who examined the piece under controlled lighting that concealed the deception's tells. But why would she risk her reputation for a single fraud? I asked. Magnus retrieved his phone and showed us a photograph he had discreetly taken during our interview. Observe Signora Rossi's jewelry. Those pearls are genuine Tahitian specimens worth at least 50,000 euros. Her watch is a vintage Patek Philippe valued at considerably more. Her clothing and accessories suggest resources far exceeding what a legitimate antique dealer should possess. Professor Contini sank into his chair, the full implications becoming clear. She has been systematically defrauding collectors. The authentication experts were probably accomplices, and the entire auction was staged. Almost certainly, Magnus agreed. The sophisticated reproduction was created specifically to deceive you, using your known preferences and expertise against you. The mirror appears authentic under most conditions, but reveals its true nature only under direct morning sunlight, when the modern glass and silver backing cannot replicate the optical qualities of genuine 17th century Venetian craftsmanship. But how did you know? Professor Contini asked weakly. Your description of discovering the deception this morning, combined with the room's Eastern orientation and the timing of Dr. Martinelli's evening examination, suggested that lighting conditions were crucial. Additionally, Signora Rossi's evasive responses during our interview and her obvious wealth indicated ongoing fraudulent activities. The final confirmation came from examining the mirror under magnification, which revealed tool marks consistent with modern manufacturing techniques, albeit expertly concealed. As if summoned by our discussion, Professor Contini's doorbell rang. Through the window, we could see police vehicles in the driveway. Magnus had apparently contacted the authorities while I was absorbed in his explanation. The investigation will undoubtedly reveal a network of fraudulent transactions targeting wealthy collectors, Magnus said as we heard footsteps approaching the study. Signora Rossi's operation was sophisticated but ultimately undone by her greed and overconfidence. Inspector Carbone of the Milan police entered with several officers, greeting Magnus with obvious familiarity. Another case solved before we even knew there was a crime, he said with grudging admiration. What did you discover this time? As Magnus explained the situation to the police, I reflected on the extraordinary events of the past 2 days. His method seemed almost supernatural, yet every deduction was based on careful observation and logical reasoning. The case had been solved not through conventional investigation, but through understanding the scientific principles underlying the deception. Within hours, the authorities had arrested Signora Rossi and her accomplices, recovering dozens of authentic artworks that had been replaced with sophisticated reproductions. The scope of the fraud exceeded even Magnus's initial estimates, with victims across Europe who had unknowingly purchased worthless copies while their genuine antiques were sold on the black market. Professor Contini proved philosophical about his loss once the shock wore off. At least I know the truth now, he said as we prepared to leave his villa. And I have witnessed the most remarkable demonstration of investigative brilliance imaginable. During our return journey to Milan, I found myself studying Magnus with new appreciation. His methods were unorthodox but undeniably effective, combining scientific knowledge with psychological insight and relentless logical analysis. More importantly, I realized that his initial assessment had been correct. Our skills were indeed complementary. Dr. Torretti, he said as our taxi navigated the evening traffic, I believe this partnership has considerable potential. Your psychological expertise proved invaluable in assessing our subject's credibility and motivations. I am still processing everything I have witnessed, I admitted. Your deductive abilities seem almost impossible. Nothing impossible, merely the application of systematic observation and logical reasoning. Every detail tells a story if one knows how to read it properly. Your medical training provides you with observational skills that complement my methods perfectly. As we reached the city center, Magnus turned to me with what might have been the first genuine smile I had seen from him. I have several pending cases that would benefit from your involvement. Are you interested in continuing this collaboration? Looking back now, I realize that moment marked the true beginning of our partnership. The case of the Venetian mirror had demonstrated not only Magnus's extraordinary abilities, but also the potential for our combined skills to solve mysteries that would baffle conventional investigators. Yes, I replied without hesitation. I am very interested indeed. The rain had stopped by the time we reached my apartment building, and the evening air carried the promise of autumn's chill. As I watched Magnus disappear into the Milano night, I knew that my life as a simple forensic psychologist had ended, replaced by something far more challenging and infinitely more intriguing. Little did I realize that this first case would prove to be among the simpler puzzles we would encounter together, and that the criminal mind's capacity for elaborate deception had depths we had barely begun to explore.